Greetings, friends. This is Chris Batts, your host of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. In today's episode, I spoke with a law firm consultant, and we discussed all things law firm related from a high level, including the impact of COVID-19, merger trends and advice, debt, real estate, competition, and much more. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast and leave a review on iTunes. As many of you know, we interview corporate defense, law firm leaders, partners, general counsel, and legal consultants. You're listening to episode 43 of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast.
Broadcasting from Kansas City, this is the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. In each episode, you'll receive actionable ideas and hear personal leadership stories of both men and women serving as leaders and executives in the legal industry. Enjoy a front row seat as Chris Batts speaks with general counsel, legal consultants, and law firm leaders and law partners at the top corporate defense law firms from around the United States.
Welcome to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Batts with the Lion Group. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Kristin Stark, principal at Fairfax Associates. Kristin is based in California and advises law firms on strategy development and implementation, organizational management and structure, financial management, and compensation. Prior to establishing Fairfax in the United States, Kristin was a senior director with Hildebrandt, Baker, and Robbins, advising law firm clients on strategy and management topics. Before joining Hildebrandt, Kristin was a senior consultant with Deloitte as a managing consultant for Fortune 100 companies. Kristin has a bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame and an MBA from London Business School. Welcome, Kristin, to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Kristin, I know that you've had a busy year so far, and I'm glad we were able to get on your calendar, even in the midst of COVID-19. I am excited to talk about this because you have such a strong background as a consultant. So I'd really like to start from the beginning, knowing that you had a degree from University of Notre Dame and an MBA from London Business School. What led you to land a consultant job at Deloitte?
Well, Notre Dame has a very big alumni recruiting effort. And so when I was at Notre Dame, I was recruited by Notre Dame alumni at Deloitte. And it's a very engaging process, or at least it was back then, I should say. And so they kind of pull you in culturally into the Deloitte culture, and you develop a lot of camaraderie. And so I interned there, and I just kind of fell in love with the idea of being part of their consulting team. And I had wanted to go into consulting as a potential opportunity, but once I met the people at Deloitte and the Notre Dame alumni network there, I was really drawn to it.
What about consulting? Why was that a peak of interest when you were studying at Notre Dame?
Well, it was actually, so this was, in the 90s, and there was a big technology growth area, and a lot of people were actually, so Andersen Consulting, if you'll recall, This was the time when Andersen Consulting was growing by leaps and bounds every year. And I actually almost took an offer at Andersen Consulting as well. So that was one of the other options I considered. But consulting was probably one of the biggest career opportunities coming out of the business school at Notre Dame, the undergraduate business program. I was a marketing major, interestingly, only because my sister had been a marketing major at Notre Dame, and I was impressed by her degree. But once I got into marketing, I realized it was not for me. So I started taking more accounting and finance classes. And then that kind of led me into a desire to be more of a holistic management consultant and not focus on marketing and not focus specifically on finance and accounting, but to cover broader management consulting.
And it's interesting. So you joined Deloitte, I think it was 98. Is that correct? 97,
correct,
98?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the beginning of the tech boom. Were you working with tech companies when you were at Deloitte, the Fortune 100 companies?
No, well, some. So actually I did do a project when Hewlett Packard acquired Compaq way back when.
Oh, wow.
Sounds like so long ago. And then, so I was on that project for quite some time. And this was back in the day, and they probably still do this, but Deloitte would send you out on a Sunday and you'd come home Thursday night. So we'd be gone the whole week or even Friday. And so I was up in Colorado for almost half a year. And then I moved to a Boeing project and did that for some time. And then I started getting more into the finance world and started working with some partnerships and it was privately held businesses in the finance industry. And that's actually what led me to look at legal consulting coming out of business school. So when I went and did my MBA, I did some more projects internationally for privately held companies and partnerships, and found that I really enjoyed the ability to influence decision makers at the very senior level, something which is much harder to do in a large Fortune 50 or Fortune 100 company where there's just many, many layers of management and many layers of bureaucracy. When you look at, privately held companies and partnerships, you're able to get to decision makers and work on critical strategic issues with the top decision makers in the organization very readily. You don't have as many layers.
It's so interesting. So you picked the law firm world, but there's partnerships in all kinds of industries. Why law? Or were you also when you were entertaining jobs at Notre Dame, there was different options on your plate? I'm just curious.
It was more happenstance. So I've never really considered a legal career or a career in the legal industry until joining Hildebrandt in the early 2000s. And so when I was doing my MBA, I was consulting to some privately held companies in the UK and in Hong Kong. I lived in Hong Kong for some time. And so those partnerships and the privately held companies, you're dealing with the kind of the managing member of them. And it gives you this exposure to be able to have conversations about their most critical business issues that they're facing. And so when I was coming out of business school, I interviewed with Hildebrandt, and they told me that same story. They told me how they do influence very high performing and mid performing and small and large and mid-sized law firms about their most critical business issues. And it was, very intriguing. So that it was actually just Hildebrandt's unique kind of practice that led me into legal consulting.
And you were with Hildebrandt for some years. Can you tell us what really got your attention when you're doing it? I mean, you saw the growth of the legal industry just explode, correct?
When I joined Hildebrandt, it was still a privately held business. So it was actually a partnership. And then Thomson Reuters acquired Hildebrandt after I joined. I believe that was in 2004, late 2004.
Okay.
And so that was a really big change for Hildebrandt because they then, they essentially sold to Thomson Reuters and became part of a large, Fortune 1000 business and a consulting division within Thomson Reuters. And so when that happened, we did have more resources at our fingertips, which was useful. It was at the time when Thomson Reuters was also launching Peer Monitor, which is a product that still exists, and they had pretty significant research capabilities. And so it was a very exciting time in the legal industry because it was the boom period leading up to the Great Recession of where, we call it the golden years, where law firms experienced revenue per lawyer growth and profits per partner growth of somewhere around, 5 to 7% on average per year.
Wow.
So really phenomenal growth rates in the legal industry during that period. And those were my early years in consulting to law firms. And Thomson, we ultimately stayed part of Thomson through the Great Recession, and we spun out in 2011.
Tell me about that spun out, because I know there is just a lot of respect for the Hildebrandt group at Thomson Reuters. What happened with the spin out, or why did that occur?
Well, I believe my understanding, and I was a senior director at the time, Thomson felt that consulting was really not part of its core competency.
Okay.
And I don't believe that Hildebrandt consultants had really flourished. There had been some people who'd left the organization to go in-house to law firms. And I think they were just realizing that they're much more of a product and legal services technology-based business as opposed to a management consulting practice. And so I actually recall June 29th, they announced that they were going to get out of the consulting practice, and it was effective June 30th. And so we formed Fairfax, I think it was July 5th. So there were several spin-outs, and ours was one. And we had, my partner, Lisa Smith, is based in DC, and we joined colleagues who'd actually left Thomson, left Hildebrandt ahead of us, who were in London. And so we had a London, DC, California presence.
Hi, listeners. This is Chris Batts, legal recruiter and owner of The Lion Group. My team and I place legal and compliance talent around the United States and are known for our level of communication, speed, and strong track record. If you're an employer hiring your first attorney or first general counsel, or adding talent to your corporate legal department or compliance team, we should talk. Also, if you're a corporate defense law partner or group wondering about your options for a lateral move, we should also talk. Every aspect of our process is confidential, fast, and thorough. Contact us by going to our website, findthelions.com, or you can text the word headhunter to the number 44222, and then complete the web form, and we'll follow up with you shortly. Now back to the show. So you started with Lisa and some colleagues in London, Fairfax Associates. Give us the landscape of 2011. I mean, 2009, 2010 was kind of almost a bloodbath, or was a bloodbath for law firms, just really painful in getting into the market of 2011. What was the atmosphere then?
Our practice was pretty busy from the get-go. In that year, I was working really heavily on a couple of mergers. One was in the press where it's a firm called Loose Forward that was acquired by McKenna Long,
Yep.
later became Dentons. And so, the practice was pretty busy at that time. And then from there on, I'd say it just grew exponentially. As law firms started to recover from the Great Recession, we got busier and busier, and the work has changed. But I'd say back then, law firms were still kind of in the recovery mode in the 2011, 2012 time period. We were doing a lot of merger work. We were looking at a lot of cross-border mergers, and we still are. But in the interim period between those early days when we founded Fairfax, we did see quite a spike in strategic planning work over the past 5 to 7 years in particular. A lot of firms started to really look at their competitive position and say, gosh, the industry is changing so much. And even though it might not appear to be a very significant change to those outside of legal, perhaps even glacial change to those outside of legal, it's a rapid change for those inside law firms. And so law firms have been looking for ways to respond to that change and really trying to step back and say, our competitors are changing, our clients are changing, how are we going to respond? And so we've been very, very busy with strategic planning work over the past 5 to 7 years. Partner compensation is an evergreen topic. And so law firms are always having those conversations around partner compensation. And so that's remained, a hot topic within law firms. Innovation was a really big topic for many years, I would say. I was doing a lot of innovation-related work, 2013, 14, 15, 16. And I wouldn't say that's gone away, but I would say law firms who have invested have already invested. Others have not invested as heavily. And it'll be interesting to see what they do coming out of this new crisis. But it's, I would say it's morphed quite a bit from 2011 to today, 2020, where we've gone.
I would I would definitely agree with you on that. So we are going to hit on several subjects, just kind of things you see going forward and pre-COVID, post-COVID, or in the middle of COVID. But before we get into the thick of that, let's just talk for a moment about law firm combinations and merger. Would you explain to my listeners why law firms are exploring merger right now?
So we can kind of differentiate between pre-COVID and right now, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
I would say pre-COVID, the primary rationale for looking at merger, and there are a handful of reasons, but I'd say that the primary reasons would be a desire to improve the firm's strategic positioning with regard to its practice focus or expertise focus. And that could be areas of specialization where they are really offering something that is better than the competition. And clients choose that law firm because they're differentiated in that expertise area. And that could be practice-based, or it could also be industry-based, right? And so firms were looking to add to that, to cement it, to build on it. And in many cases, they would also be looking at supplementary areas that help them maintain that differentiated position or secure it. So I'd say practice and industry expertise tend to be one of the biggest drivers of merger focus, merger interest. Another would be geographic, really trying to figure out how to round out the firm's geographic platform, reach markets that clients have demand in that the firm doesn't have a presence in. In many cases, firms have also gone ahead and opened offices in very competitive markets. They've struggled with, maintaining or growing those offices because they are so competitive. And then they're looking for mergers to really support that office and to build it out further because the lateral strategy has been challenging. In some cases, another reason, in addition to kind of the expertise, practice, industry, and the geographic piece would be clients. If you've got specific clients that are saying, we're looking for much more of a branded firm. This is happening. We're calling it scale-based mergers. Okay. And it's not a growth for growth's sake mentality. That is something that's been widely criticized within legal, rightfully so, for many years. And outside of legal, it's been deemed to be a strategy for failure, is a growth for growth's sake mentality. But scale is different. Scale is when you have clients saying to your firm, we need to start choosing law firms that have more known names. They're more credible brands. And, we love some of your lawyers at your small firm, but we simply can't keep using you for our important work, certainly not for our about the company work, but even for our higher value work, because we have a board of directors or public company exposure, and we're getting criticism for using firms that might not be safe bets. So that's been part of the client-driven conversation around merger. Or part of the other piece of it would be clients looking for broader teams, deeper teams of lawyers. You might have 2 M&A lawyers, but we need 20. We're not comfortable with you only having 2 M&A lawyers. So that skill conversation kind of covers both, brand positioning as well as breadth and depth of teams and the overall size of the firm.
Kristin, you've seen, whether your own personal involvement, your Fairfax, or just from observation, that kind of activity of law firm merger and combinations. What are law firm leaders doing right, and what are they not doing right when it comes to this process?
I would say that one of the big challenges that we see in law firms exploring merger, it tends, in some cases, when law firms are reactive in exploring merger. And I would differentiate reactive from just opportunistic. Some firms will say, oh, we're opportunistic, meaning that if we get approached by an opportunity, we'll look at it. And that's, certainly one strategy, and it works well for some combinations. But in those cases, when a firm is opportunistic, they are educated and aware of the range of growth opportunities available to them. And so that's why it can work out to be opportunistic. As when a firm is reactive, though, oftentimes they aren't aware or educated of the merger opportunities that are out there. And so they get approached by one particular opportunity and they decide to pursue it without really going through a process to understand, is there another combination, another merger that would be a better fit for us strategically, that would benefit our clients more, that would benefit our talent more. And so our view is that either a proactive approach or at least a more educated approach is going to be a more successful approach, because then you're going to understand, what are we looking for in merger, right? What is the strategic rationale for us to pursue a merger? How will it benefit our clients? How will it benefit our talent? How will it make us more competitive in the marketplace? And without that conversation, if firms are just responding to one specific firm and they haven't looked at how they fit into the marketplace and how merger might or might not benefit them, generally speaking, then, they can kind of go down the path without really giving it enough of an educated view. And so it's critical that firms kind of have that more holistic sense before they jump into a merger conversation.
Since you've been a consultant, and since I've been recruiting, we've seen a lot happen in the industry. Firms have failed. Firms have been rescued by other firms in calm combinations. What's your prediction because of COVID-19 and the rest of 2020 and 2021, 2022? What do you predict is going to happen?
So unfortunately, I do believe we will have some firms which struggle as a result of the crisis. And typically, what we tend to see is we'll see departures. And those departures will potentially be driven by the fact that the firm management has not responded effectively to the crisis, or that in some cases, even if they've attempted to respond, their response hasn't been sufficient. And it's in part the business decisions that they're making, of course, right? That is part of their response. But another piece of the response has to be about how they communicate with their stakeholders, with their partners, with all of their firm members, with their clients about the crisis, about how the firm's weathering the crisis, and that they create a sense of buy-in and teamwork that would hold people together. It creates this organizational glue that can weather the crisis. And so when partners in particular, but talent in general, doesn't feel that management is doing all that it needs to do to bind the firm together, to make good business decisions, to communicate effectively during difficult times, they self-select, right? They start leaving and looking for opportunities where they perceive another firm, a competitor, is going to be better managed. It's going to have better communication. It's going to come out of the crisis better positioned. And those departures are what will trigger instability for some firms, right? It's a combination of the departures and then the likely pressure that we're going to see on law firm economics over the next year as clients delay payments or they tell law firms pencils down, we're going to do less work. And so as firms experience departures and they experience revenue declines and profitability pressure, it's going to squeeze them. And if they're proactive, they will start looking for a Hail Mary pass merger and they won't move towards dissolution mode. If they don't see what's coming, then they'll end up in, a very difficult position, and it'll be a very late stage merger, or even firms picking apart essentially groups that are left as the firm goes into dissolution. And unfortunately, I do think we're going to see some of those out of this crisis.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I believe we're going to see that happening. Hi, friends. This is Chris Batts. I wanted to take a moment and say thank you for listening to this podcast. I really appreciate you, and right now I need your help. I would love to hear your feedback. Please share your ideas on who I should interview and what are the topics that interest you right now. I have 2 easy ways for you to share. Number 1, text the phrase LFL podcast to the number 44222. That's LFL PODCAST. Or by clicking the Give Feedback link to the show notes on your device. Again, I would love your ideas on who I should interview and topics that interest you the most. Please take a moment and do this now. Thank you, everyone. And now back to the show. Let's talk about, I guess for me, the elephant in the room here. Debt has been a friend at times, and most times it's a master to firms. What are the trends that you have seen either with clients or just in general in the market with law firms utilizing debt? What advice would you give law firms around debt?
Well, I think that's another really good question, and one that I would hope our law firm leaders are really thinking about right now. Coming into the crisis, a lot of firms were worried about cash shortages. And so many firms, I would say, maybe not most, but most of our clients that we were working with accessed their line of credit and pulled their line of credit in, even if they were out of their line of credit, which many of our clients are out of their line of credit by the end of the first quarters typically. And so firms access their line in order to have cash reserves in the event that there was a liquidity crisis. We do see some firms going ahead and repaying that line now because production has been holding at about 90 to 95% through April. And collections have been slowing down, but not as badly as some had feared. And so we do see some of our firms going ahead and paying off their lines. In terms of long-term debt, firms aren't making significant moves on that right now. Hopefully those are longer-term notes, 5-year notes, maybe even longer in some cases. But generally, I'd say firms are trying to manage their debt carefully, right? We need to be very careful about not assuming a lot of debt while preserving liquidity. And so that line of credit is an important cash flow mechanism because it's going to enable firms to get through any kind of cash flow pressure that they might experience if clients start using them like a bank, which happened during the Great Recession. But at the same time, we don't want our firms to remain in their line and use that line of credit or other sources of debt to pay partners. I mean, that is really the best advice we can give to law firms right now is do not borrow to pay partners. And most law firms of any size understand that principle, and they tend to be fairly debt averse and not use other people's money to pay partners or future profits to pay partners. But that is probably one of the riskiest debt strategies that law firms can take is to pay partners on future profits or on borrowed money.
Would it be fair to say that we, as the legal industry and law firms, are in a new age for real estate utilization? With everyone and most all law firms have sent their people home, and then they're kind of beginning to explore and bringing them back. What's your thoughts around real estate? It's always been one of the highest costs, highest P&L items. Where do you see that trend going?
Well, certainly when all of this started, right, and we had law firms quickly moving to remote working arrangements, and something that I would say most law firms had not embraced heavily. I mean, obviously you have the virtual firms, but most traditional firms were pretty heavily in-person operations up until the start of this crisis. And so the move to remote working in those initial weeks, I believe, triggered a lot of rethinking of space. And so unfortunately for a lot of our law firm clients, they are in long-term lease arrangements. So it's going to take a few years for firms to adjust their space requirements and to adjust their leases. But I do believe this has opened up lawyers' eyes and particularly people who might be more traditionalist in terms of being in person to the fact that it is very easy to work remotely. There was, even some recent articles just in the past couple of days of law firms leaders saying, look, we've now proven that we can work remotely successfully and we don't need space. Now, one of the opposing forces that we might experience over the short term, and this might help law firms effectively utilize the space that they do have while they run out their current lease arrangements, is that with social distancing, law firms may actually, need the space that they have in the short term until the crisis is passed, because they're going to have to potentially spread people out more. We do have a lot of legal assistants working in cubicles outside of lawyers' offices. And so it's going to be, law firms are going to think about how when they come back into the office, how they're going to start spreading people out. And that might require them to use their space over this short-term period. But, 1, 2 years, 3 years from now, as law firms started renegotiating their leases, of course, they really need to be thinking about how to shed some of that very, very high cost overhead, because this is a way for firms to get rid of expenses and work more efficiently for their clients without compromising the teamwork. And we can talk more about that. But that is something that law firms have found during this crisis, is that they've learned to work remotely while preserving teamwork and preserving some of the critical aspects of that in-person environment.
So, Kristin, you came from one of the big four. You came from Deloitte, and there's been lots written over the past several years about the big accounting firms starting to encroach or potentially compete against law firms. What's your take on them, and what advice would you give law firm leaders?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, the biggest challenges for law firm leaders is that the big four, of course, do represent a very significant competitive force in the industry. Unfortunately, I believe it's not fully understood by law firms about the magnitude of the competition that's coming from the big four. And in part, it's because I would say that, law firms get to know their competition by knowing some of their peers. They know managing partners at other regional firms or other national firms, even other global firms, right? There tends to be some networking that's done among law firm leaders where they're able to learn about what their competitors are doing through leaders getting to know other leaders and sharing information, which, doesn't harm the competitive position of either firm, but helps the leaders understand what they're up against. I believe that, unfortunately, a lot of law firms don't have relationships in the big four to understand what the big four are doing. And the big four, I believe, are also, they're very strategic, right? They have a lot of resources to invest. They have a lot of technology capabilities. And I don't believe that law firms fully understand where the big four are investing, how they plan to compete, and how they're going to be positioned 3 or 5 years from now. And so I think one of the biggest opportunities and challenges for law firms is to really start to gauge, what are the big four doing and where are they going to be 3 or 5 years from now, and how will that impact an individual firm's position in the marketplace?
Kristin, I know that you're a student of leadership, and so I wanted to ask a couple questions around that. How do you define leadership? And then also, I'd love for you to list some books or recommend some books on leadership that you typically recommend to your clients.
When we talk to our clients about leadership, and we are often involved in governance-related projects, right, where we're helping, particularly right now, I'd say over the past few years, we've been involved in projects where we're helping law firms who have had long-running leadership work on leadership succession and leadership changeover. And we talk about leadership as the ability to influence. And in particular, in a law firm environment, the ability to influence your peers and the ability to influence others to do things that they might not otherwise do if left to their own devices. And so from our vantage point, in terms of law firm leadership, we really try to think about it as peer-based leadership, right? Your ability to convince people who are seen as your equals to do the things that they need to do, which are best for the entity, which are best for the organization. And so I think that if we're talking about it in that context, one of the best books that we would recommend was one called Aligning the Stars. And it's a bit of a leadership book as well as a kind of how to develop professionals and talent leadership development That book is famous and has been around forever, but it's certainly one of the ones I would recommend the most. And it talks a little bit about pulling together in professional services organizations, true stars, and the challenges, the leadership challenges that are inherent in bringing together people who are all very free thinkers. Oftentimes they're very skeptical, and then influencing them to do the things to align their behavior in a way which benefits the organization.
You're married and have kids, correct?
Yes, I have married. I got married in 2004, and I have two little girls who are 6 and 10.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. And I think you told me you have a dog as well?
I do. We have a golden retriever. Yes, he is a big part of our family.
That's awesome. So you have 3 kids or 4 kids?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, my husband is very young, playful spirit, so he qualifies.
Talk to me about COVID. I mean, how has that affected you as a family?
It's interesting that you asked that. With the kids being at home, it's been a challenge. My husband is in semiconductor, and so his work is actually essential, and he's been going into the office every day. I guess we need to keep developing phone chips so that we can, sell cell phones to people and communicate. But my kids have been here, of course, and they've been great. I mean, fortunately, I think I've just been really blessed with very well-behaved children. So they've been very cooperative as I'm on Zoom meetings. I haven't had them run behind me yet on video conference, thankfully. The dog, yes, that has happened. But the kids have been great. But it is, I think one of the challenges we're going to face for our law firm clients is as we all try to head back to some sense of normalcy, we've got dual working parents. We're going to really struggle with having kids at home. Yeah. And how do we deal with that childcare need?
Yeah. Whether COVID happened or didn't happen, do you guys typically have summer plans to enjoy and get away?
We were supposed to be heading to Costa Rica on June 4th for a week away, or June 5th, but that's been rescheduled, unfortunately. So yeah, I don't know what we're going to do, to be honest with you. I think we'll just try to kind of create a fun environment for our kids. I'm a big believer in trying to let my kids be kids. Yeah. And so we live in Southern California, where fortunately the weather tends to be pretty great. So we'll just try and get them outside. I think we're going to probably have to put off travel, but maybe we can have some creative weekends, do some fun things around here and get out to the beach.
Kristin, last question for you. What is your superpower?
That's a really good question. In our work, we often are delivering difficult messages. We're telling people things that they might not want to hear. And so one of the things that I believe as a skill of mine is that I do it with empathy. So, I deliver difficult messages, but in a way which is hopefully something that most people can digest or hear. And it allows them to be able to take action on it as a result.
Kristin, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone who listened to this episode of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. If you haven't already, please take a moment and subscribe. Also, we would love your feedback. You can leave feedback in 3 easy ways. You can go to the blog post on our website. You can click Give Feedback link in the show notes on your device. And then thirdly, you can text the phrase LFL podcast to the number 44222. That's LFL PODCAST. And thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. This podcast is for education purposes only. This content cannot be used for commercial use without written permission from the Lion Group. If you like this podcast, leave a review on iTunes.